When I was still teaching in the classroom, I always start at the beginning of the year with the novel The Phantom Toll Booth by Norton Juster. And it's a wonderful book about a boy who finds nothing interesting. Everything bores him. He's very apathetic. He didn't see the point of not only like all the education and everything they were trying to teach him, but also why life was so amazing, why numbers and words were so important, and colors and music. He had no fascination at all with the world around him. So I always like starting the year with that novel. So as we start, the very beginning, chapter 1, we are introduced to Milo and his attitude towards everything and how nothing even in his own place excites him or the toys or games that his parents buy him. Now we were turning the page to like the second or third page. So extremely early on with the reading. And one of the students in that classroom that particular year let out this loud groan. I mean, the entire class heard it. And I was thinking like, "Oh my goodness, we're only 2 pages into this novel. Give it a chance here." I talked with that student later, and I asked him, "Why did you groan so loudly while we were reading?" And he basically just said, "Well, it's because I hate reading." And that phrase right there is a phrase that a lot of parents and teachers, I'm sure, can empathize with. The student who says, I hate reading. But why is that? Why are there students who claim to hate reading? Well, there's a lot that goes on behind it. There's a lot of skills that are being asked of a student while they read. And if they have any gaps in any of those skills, reading becomes exhausting. And so we're going to take a look at why students develop that mindset of, I hate reading. Well, thanks for tuning in to the Lil Will Learning Company. If you're looking for structured academic tutoring or structured academic curriculum, come check us out. And we especially recommend our core academic skills system, which deals with all of arithmetic, reading fluency grades 1 through 8, and spelling grades 1 through 8 as well. It is a wonderful product that's meant to give your child a very strong foundation to their academic journey. But without further ado, let's dive into the topic of why students say, I hate reading. So, one thing to understand is that students who are not strong in reading, it's very mentally exhausting for them. Let's take a reader who is strong, who is doing everything correctly. That strong reader actually underestimates the amount of skills happening all at once and the amount of cognitive resources or cognitive energy being used to read well. Now, let's take another student who is struggling. Now, that student who is struggling to read has to be doing many things all at once while reading. So, first, they have to decode correctly. They have to correctly identify the letters and sounds that are appearing on the page. Then, once they can decode accurately, they have to do it very fluently with automaticity to the point where decoding just becomes nearly effortless. And that then frees up their brain to worry about the vocabulary, what the words actually mean, and then to the actual reading comprehension. But even with reading comprehension, they have to keep track of what they've read. What did they say in that previous sentence, the previous paragraph, the previous page or chapter? What has been going on in the story so far? And then what is literally happening right now? What is the author saying between the lines of here? Basically, what can I infer about what the characters are doing and what will happen into the future of this book? All those things are happening all at once for a reader. And if someone is, as a student, if they're lacking in any of those skills, well, that gap in skills compounds over years, which makes everything else struggle. So really, it's just mentally exhausting for them. Like, if they can't decode correctly, they certainly will struggle to know what the words mean and struggle to explain what they just read on the page because they're so focused on just decoding what they see in front of them at first. Often when we see these struggling readers, we see what looks like frustration, or they're distracted, or they have fatigue, because there is truth to it that if there's any gaps in those skills, well, reading is very mentally exhausting for them now. So they're not avoiding reading because they're lazy. They're avoiding reading because it is overwhelming cognitively for them. If a student is still working on decoding and it's slow, that will impair their comprehension. So, what I mean by this is when they're decoding, if they are, let's say, sounding out the words and they are sounding them out accurately. Well, of course, that's a very good step, but you do want to develop that fluency to it as well. The point to where they can read it smoothly, quickly, with good prosody. Now, the reason why that is, it's not necessarily to make a reader fast, although that helps. It's just so that it becomes automatic for them. They develop what's called automaticity. And that automaticity, while they're decoding, it just reduces the amount of cognitive resources or cognitive energy that's required from them to read. Because once you reduce that cognitive energy from them, well, that frees them up to work on understanding the vocabulary and then to work on the reading comprehension to understand what the text is actually saying. So understand, just because they can read the words accurately, it's not the same thing as understanding the meaning behind it. And the more fluent we can make them with their decoding, the more fluency they can develop, the more automaticity they develop, that frees them up to understand the vocabulary and the meaning of the text. Another important detail is any gaps in vocabularies, it will definitely reduce their understanding of what they read. So vocabulary is very massively underestimated. The more words a student knows and knows the meaning of, it just increases not only the complexity of what they can read, it increases the amount of what they can read. And it's going to be one of those things where students with a large vocabulary will tend to then read more. They'll tend to understand more. Because they read more, they are exposed to more words, and therefore their vocabulary will increase even more because they're exposed to those words, and they will just move further and further and further ahead. But now let's take a student who is, let's say, weaker in vocabulary. They have less words they understand, and even let's just say for this example, you have a student who is struggling. They read a page and there's already 5 words they don't understand. They don't know the meaning of, they don't understand what the words mean. And so it makes it hard for them to understand what's going on with the novel and with the story and all that. It affects their comprehension. And so then they will get frustrated. Then they'll read less because they're frustrated by the fact that they don't know what these words mean. Because they'll read less, that exposes them to less vocabulary because they're not reading newer things. And now imagine that year after year after year after year, it compounds over time. And so vocabulary is a really important piece to comprehension. And a student's ability to grow their vocabulary is very strongly tied to their reading success. So a lot of this ends up becoming struggling readers. They'll begin to avoid reading. So I'll give a quick example before we tie it back into reading. So again, avoidance is a symptom. And if you've ever worked with like a PA system and a microphone and a speaker, you get what's called like a feedback loop. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're speaking into a microphone, and as you speak into it, the sound from the microphone goes to the speaker. But let's say the speaker's like positioned right behind the microphone. Well, as the speaker sends the sound out, it goes into the microphone, which then goes through the cable back to the speaker, which then goes out the speaker, but then back into the microphone, through the cable back to the speaker. It creates this feedback loop. It's a very loud, high pitch, nearly blast your ears apart kind of a noise. And for anyone who's ever worked with a PA system before understands that frustration. But it's the same thing with struggling readers and them avoiding reading. So what happens is a struggling reader, when they don't have that fluency and they don't have a lot of vocabulary knowledge, they'll begin to avoid reading. And the problem with that is they have to deal with repeated failures and repeated stress while reading. Because if you don't know what you're reading, if you can't explain what you're reading, it's very frustrating. It's mentally exhausting. And instead of having to deal with that, they just start to avoid reading. the problem with that is that as they avoid more reading, well, that means they're going to get exposed to less vocabulary, which means that now their vocabulary doesn't grow. And when they will eventually be exposed to more difficult texts later on in the years, instead of growing with the difficulty of the text, their ability to read has basically, the gap has widened more and more. So now they're dealing with even more difficult vocabulary and even more difficult text, which means they will avoid it even more than before. And as that happens year after year after year after year, it gets to a point where that foundational skill of reading, the gap has widened so much and compounded so much that they develop that mindset of, well, I'm not improving with this. And not only am I not improving, but everything's getting harder and harder. I hate reading. So that avoidance is really just the response to being constantly overwhelmed by all the various tasks that reading requires of them. Now, as they struggle more and more with reading, well, that will impact their identity as a reader. So we've always started with this phrase where students say, I hate reading. But that comes from failing over and over and over with reading. And that failure, again, looks like reading slowly or not knowing what these words mean or never being able to say, like, here's what's happening in the story. Here's what these characters are doing. Here's what I think will happen. And having those repeated failures and stress to constantly deal with. This ultimately just lowers their confidence in reading. And it creates this internal identity of, I'm just bad at reading. I'm not very smart. I've never seemed to have done this correctly while all my classmates seem to be doing it correctly. That just creates a sense of embarrassment and failure. And again, all that results in that identity or that phrase of, well, I just must hate reading because I'm never good at this. The truth is, though, that a lot of early intervention can help address a lot of these issues. So instead of letting these reading failures go on for weeks, months, and then eventually years, the earlier these interventions are applied, then the better chance we all have to help these students become more successful, confident readers. But if we allow these reading struggles to go on, never get addressed, it will become a part of their identity that they struggle as a reader, hence they hate reading. So if we had to rebuild a student's reading ability, what would that look like? Well, to visualize it, if we took reading as 4 components working together. First is their decoding, which is phonics. Can they take the letters and the sounds, blend them together, and do it accurately? The next component is the fluency of that. Can they do it with automaticity, with very little conscious effort? Because with that, their brains then freed up for the third component, which is vocabulary, to understand what the words mean. And if they know what the words mean, then they read for reading comprehension, the fourth component, where they have to literally explain what's going on, to predict what will happen in the future, to read between the lines of the book, to say, here's how this character's feeling based on their actions. So there's a lot of things going on, but to focus on the specific part that that student is struggling with in that moment. So are they struggling with decoding? Well, work with them on their phonics, teach them all the blends, the digraphs, and the letter sounds and all that. But if they are doing that accurately, well, then work on their fluency. Because if they're reading slowly, that's always going to affect their comprehension. So work on their fluency. So there are individual components to work on to help them with their reading success. But now that we know what all of those individual components are to work on with reading, the question then becomes, well, how? Again, a lot of reading failures have to do with repeated failures over many weeks, months, even years. No matter which component was not fully developed, the point is that repeated failure, it really is a part of their reading identity now. So when we do give these interventions, we have to build it with them having constant success. You have to reverse that feeling of feeling like a constant failure or constantly failing at reading. So let's say it really is just working on their decoding, but build it in so that when they understand the sound, the letter, they have success right away and consistently over and over. So a lot of the intervention is which component are they struggling in, but then built it in a way that they have constant success because that will eventually change their mindset of not having these constant failures, but like, hey, you know what? Now I am having success and I am understanding how this is sounded out or how fluently I should sound when I read this, or I know what these 5 words mean now because I understand like root words, prefixes, suffixes, and so on and so forth. So with that intervention, build that constant success and that success will change their motivation to read and their identity as a reader. So the thing is, with students saying they hate to read, it's not that they hate to read, it's just that they hate feeling so overwhelmed by all the various tasks that reading demands of them. And if they're struggling at any one of those components, then it's just, again, it's overwhelming for them. That's what they hate. They hate the feeling of being overwhelmed while reading. With interventions, we can basically build up those components of reading so that they become more accurate readers, faster readers, and then therefore more confident readers who can explain what they're reading. That way, reading becomes faster, it becomes easier, and it becomes more enjoyable because there's these tremendous novels now that they can read and understand and share that knowledge and experience with others. And what makes reading so important out of all the academic skills, it's really the skill that's the gateway to future learning. Reading is the ability to acquire knowledge, it's the ability to acquire information. And building strong reading foundations for any student means that they are more confident, they are more independent, and they can now become lifelong learners. Thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Please like and subscribe and come check us out at the Lil Will Learning Company. We have structured academic tutoring and structured academic curriculum. And again, we highly recommend the core academic skills system, which has arithmetic from beginning to end, reading fluency grades 1 through 8, and spelling grades 1 through 8 as well. It will give your child a tremendously strong academic foundation for years to come. And until next time, take care.